Hi guys! Missed class again today, but we're going to do it in my kitchen because it's so snowy outside and wonderful. I just want to give you a brief lecture and then you can watch me do a demo and we can even maybe speed it up, which would probably help. You can see me do a full painting. Today I'm going to demo the wet into wet watercolor technique, which means we're going to be wetting down parts of the paper before we put the pigment down. So I'll be walking you through the steps. It's going to be really fun. I have a little still life here. What I've set up is simple, if not a little wilted, but simple. I want you guys to start, especially for the beginners in the class, I want you to start with a 1 to 3 object still life. Don't go crazy. In my case, I'm not going with a lot of colors within my still life. There's a few colors represented, but I don't have flowers from the whole spectrum of the rainbow. That is also going to make it simpler for this technique. I have set up a lamp so that I have a single light source. That's going to make it easier on you as well, so you have consistent shadows, and we're going to talk about that in class in the future. But just to set yourself up for success, this is kind of what I suggest doing at home. So I have my watercolor paper here, minimum 8 by 10 size. You guys are using 140 pound. I have a nice water receptacle. I have all my brushes laid out and my palette, which we laid out last week. So before the video started, I did a little drawing. It's important to lay out your drawing in pencil first. Watercolor is all about planning, so if you can do the most specific drawing that you can using a nice soft 2B pencil or something similar that erases easily, just to lay out exactly what you're going to be painting, that's going to help you a lot. And with this particular approach, the wet into wet, it's not very specific, it's very loose, so you're not going to be able to do a lot of drawing and tiny little detail within the painting like you would with maybe other techniques. Okay, so I'm going to move the camera up over my shoulder and I'm going to kind of voice over what I'm going to be doing. So, yeah. Okay, so I've started with my paper at a little bit of an angle, as I showed you in class. That's just to keep the water flowing in one direction. And I'm starting by filling in with water the first shape that I'm going to be painting on. Now, I'm only doing one shape at a time. That's because wherever the water goes, the paint will go. Wherever the water stops, that's where the paint stops. So once I've filled in my area with water, I'm mixing alizarin crimson and some of that pink, that rose, permanent rose, or whatever color like it that you bought. And I am just starting to fill in around the edges of the petals of the rose. And you can see how the paint is stopping where the water stops, and it's bleeding into the water, and it's doing its own mixing, basically. It's not giving me a hard edge except where the paper is dry. I've added a little bit of cadmium yellow in here, and there you see a little bit of French ultramarine as well to put the shadows in. Obviously I've sped this up so you guys don't have to listen to me and watch me paint for more than 10 or 15 minutes here. Okay, I'm thinking about where the shadows are. I'm thinking about where I want my hard edges, where I want the softness of the colors blending together. You can see I put a little bit of green down there to create a shadow. I'm probably going to change my mind about that if I remember. Yeah, there we go. And a little bit more, some of that alizarin crimson mixed with French ultramarine to create a shadow. And you can see me coming in with my paper towel, basically my favorite instrument, like it more than the brushes almost. I'm coming in there and I'm not just putting pigment down while the paper is wet, but I'm also pulling it back out. It's very malleable while it's still wet. You can see me going in. As it dries, it's going to lighten, and every time you see the camera cut like that, it's because I've let the paper dry in front of my fireplace, and then I'm coming back in to do a little bit more painting in a different area. So now I've started on the second rose, and you can see that the paint lightened a little bit after it dried. You're always going to have to fight that with watercolor, so just consider that it's going to lighten up. You can always go darker, you can always put another layer on, but that's just something that you end up learning and kind of getting used to. So I'm doing exactly the same thing here, finding where my values are going to be darker, coming in along the edges of the rose, because that's really just naturally how the petals kind of form with the color, with that deep crimson color at the edges. Okay, I've cut again. That means I've let the paper dry, and now I'm coming in to do the leaves. The leaves are green and not red. Red and green, of course, are opposites on the color wheel, so we don't really want those two colors to mix together too much, because that's going to create a goopy brown. So I've definitely let those roses dry before I come in to do the green of the leaves. And here I'm just putting that water down on the paper, just where I need it to go, not letting the color bleed outside of that line. You can see I'm mixing a little bit of Hooker's green, some of the burnt umber, just to get it a little bit darker. I don't really like a super, I don't know, phthalo or spring green. I kind of like it a little bit more muted. That's why I mixed that burnt umber in there. Okay, you can see I'm going pretty fast. I think this is sped up like 8 times at this point. And I'm not doing nearly as much variation in the leaves. The leaves are not going to be my focal point. The blossoms are my focal point, so I put more detail in there. With the leaves, I'm leaving them pretty much all the same color and just doing a little bit of work, pulling some of the water out to make it lighter, meaning that my brush is wet and I'm just laying it down with clear water on it, and that kind of pushes the pigment out. Also, using a dry or a mostly dry brush will help pull that pigment out too. Clean dry brush. You can see I'm just putting a little bit of, I think there's a little bit of alizarin in there just to bring it into, I mean, we want to know that the roses and the leaves are on the same palette, so that they go together. Okay, and now I'm just thinking about my values, thinking about what I want to have be dark, where I want my details to be. I cut again, let it dry, and now I'm going to be working on the teapot. It's a little bit more ornate than I really want you guys to go, but I just couldn't help it because it's so cute. So here I'm just putting in a little bit of, it's mostly French ultramarine with I think a little bit of alizarin in there. You can see I'm thinking about where my light source is, and I'm trying to leave the white of the paper in a couple of places, and if I've messed it up or I want it to be a little bit lighter, I can just pull that pigment out while it's still wet, which is one of the really great things about this wet on wet technique. You can see one of the nice things about, so we have these soft edges, and of course when we're thinking about these form shadows, if you've taken any drawing classes, you know that as the light turns around the form, it's going to create soft edges, and so that's really, really helpful with this wet on wet technique. So I kind of sped through it here, but I wet down the background of the paper first here. It's really, really important when you're doing your background. If you can keep the paper wet in all areas, it'll keep you from having any of those lines that occur when you're dealing with watercolor. As soon as the pigment dries, you get a line in the paper, and it really can be unsightly. So I try to keep the paper as wet as possible and work as quickly as possible. You see me here dropping in more ultramarine and some, I don't know what kind of, I guess cerulean blue up in the top right, and a little bit of burnt umber to create that cast shadow. Now finally I'm coming back in, and I feel like once you put the background in, you have a different sense of the value of your painting, the different values of your painting, I should say. And so you kind of need to go back in there and maybe work in the darker areas if you feel that they need to be darker, and I felt that they needed to be darker. Okay, anyway, that was very, very fast, but you can see what the finished product is. I think you can get some really nice effects with wet on wet. It may not be as detailed as you're used to working, but there we are. Hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you in class on Wednesday.